Good evening, everyone. I'm Jason Johnson in for Joy Reid, who will be joining us in just a few minutes. We begin the readout tonight with yet another judicial gut punch. 18-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, a militiaman wannabe who crossed state lines and killed 2 human beings at a Black Lives Matter rally, was found not guilty on all 5 counts.
State of Wisconsin versus Kyle Rittenhouse. As to the first count of the information, Joseph Rosenbaum. We, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle H. Rittenhouse, not guilty. As to the second count, not guilty. As to the third count, not guilty. As to the fourth count, not guilty. As to the fifth count, not guilty.
Oh, now he's really crying. Rittenhouse, who faced life in prison, broke down in court after the verdict was read. One of his attorneys later said that Rittenhouse would like to get on with his life. He added that the judge, who was heavily criticized for his seeming bias towards the defense, was fair. He then dismissed the larger implications of the verdict.
When you want to talk about implications and precedent and things like that, is it ever going to happen again? You know, is there ever going to be just a total unrest in Kenosha or some other city, and that's going to happen? You know, I just don't see that. It was a case about self-defense, the right to protect oneself.
President Biden told reporters that we have to respect the jury's decision. And the parents of Anthony Huber, Rittenhouse's second victim, released this statement, quote, "Today's verdict means there is no accountability for the person who murdered our son. It sends the unacceptable message that armed civilians can show up in any town, incite violence, and then use the danger they have created to justify shooting people in the street. Make no mistake, our fight to hold those responsible for Anthony's death accountable continues in full force." The lawyers for the other 2 victims, Gage Ghostkurtz and Joseph Rosenbaum, said, "While today's verdict may mean justice delayed, it will not mean justice denied. We're committed to uncovering the truth of that night and holding those responsible to account." People outside the courthouse had a range of reactions to the verdict.
That's the law. The verdict, that's what they chose. We accept it. That's how it goes.
I feel like they made the right choice. You know, it was simple self-defense. That kid was attacked out here.
This argument that he killed him because of what they did, and it's okay.
Don't give him no energy.
No, it's not right.
The demonstrations at the heart of the trial were in response to the police shooting of Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times by a white Kenosha police officer and was paralyzed from the waist down. His uncle, Justin Blake, was unsparing in his criticism of the verdict.
There was no self-defense. Self-defense is when you're protecting your home, you're protecting your family. He, in a very bastardly and dastardly way, used the law that worked for him. There was absolutely no self-defense.
While it is shocking that Rittenhouse was not found guilty, it's not surprising at all. In fact, it's a return to normal for America after the conviction of former Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Joy Reid, the host of this show, Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, and president of the National Action Network, Paul Butler, former federal prosecutor and Georgetown law professor, and Elie Mystal, justice correspondent for The Nation, join us now. I cannot imagine a better panel of people that I would rather be talking to or texting with tonight. Joy, since it's your show and I'm blessed to be sitting here, just start us off. What was your first thought when you heard the verdict that Rittenhouse was going to get free?
Well, I want to first thank you, Jason, for holding down the fort tonight. I was actually on a flight because, as you know, I took today off. I was on a plane. I was watching it on the flight. I was not at all surprised. We've talked about this. I mean, this is what we expected to happen, because I think we have to keep in mind when we're watching the criminal justice system at work that it was designed to do exactly what it did today. Gun laws helped to enhance the design to allow this verdict to happen today. This country was built on the idea that white men had a particular kind of freedom and a particular kind of citizenship that only they have, that gives, you know, from the slave catchers on, the right to inflict violence in the name of protecting property. That's like the foundational creation of the United States. So it would have been shocking. As I'm glad you mentioned the Derek Chauvin verdict. That was the surprising verdict. This should have been unsurprising. But what I do think we have to think about is not only the families of the two men who died and the family of Mr. Grosskreutz. They should be in our minds right now because they suffered. And there have been a lot of white people who have, defended Black lives and paid for it with their lives. That goes all throughout our history, going back to John Brown and go through the Civil Rights Movement. But what I am concerned about is the precedent this sets for what people will believe that they can do under law when Black Lives Matter protests happen in the future. And that people may use this as an excuse to start going out of state and doing what this teenager did, believing that they'll get away with it, and in some cases, getting away with it.
I want to keep on that point, Joy. Paul, that's the first thing that occurred to me. The first thing that occurred to me after this ruling is, oh, well, okay, now it's just open season. Like, if I'm walking around and I'm a white nationalist, coward little kid with an AR-15, and I see somebody drive by with a Black Lives Matter bumper sticker and I feel threatened, I can open fire. If I go by a youth group standing outside the local Target and they're chanting Black Lives Matter and I feel threatened, I can open fire. Paul, is the ruling today really a precedent, or is this the kind of thing that was always going to end up happening and we shouldn't see this as a real watershed moment?
It's not a formal legal precedent, Jason, but make no mistake, Rittenhouse will be the poster child for reactionary white men who want to take the law in their own hands, who want to bring assault weapons to Black Lives Matter's protests, and who think that violence is a legitimate form of political discourse. In the eyes of the law, Rittenhouse is now actually the victim of the three men who he shot, even though the evidence suggests that Rittenhouse went to Kenosha spoiling for a fight. That's why he brought that semi-assault gun, the bulletproof vest, and the full metal bullets. The verdict doesn't mean that the jurors bought this Boy Scout image of Rittenhouse that the defense presented. It just means that they had reasonable doubt, that they weren't 95% certain. But Jason, I can't imagine they're happy about an immature and reckless 17-year-old bringing a semi-assault rifle to patrol their streets. And I agree with Joy. I think we should all be troubled that other people who want to take the law into their own hands might view this verdict as an invitation.
Rev, so earlier this year, I saw you on the air and you talked about, hey, part of why Derek Chauvin was convicted is because you had just massive nationwide, global, multicultural protests about George Floyd. The issue that I think a lot of people have, especially my students and young people I know who aren't actively involved in politics, is they're like, well, darn, it took a year's worth of protest to get one cop convicted, but now we're right back to what we had before, whether it's Ahmaud Arbery being killed by 3 random white men or Kyle Rittenhouse. What is the activist response when there's a ruling like this? Because I can't imagine that a lot of people don't feel despondent about years worth of protests about this kind of violence and people still getting off for essentially murder.
What you must also factor in is that even when the George Floyd murder happened, it has now come out that some of the violence in Minneapolis was done by right-wingers who pretended to be burning down places in Minneapolis, that they were part of the movement, and they were not, which means that now we can see people baiting violence to have a reaction to justify doing what Rittenhouse got away with today. This is a very, very serious problem for activism, because now we're being told that someone can cross state lines with a semi-automatic rifle and kill people and say it's self-defense, and they have this case to cite as saying that I'm like Rittenhouse. Let's remember, Rittenhouse is now being offered internships by members of Congress, like he's some hero. So in the frame of 1 week, ministers go to Brunswick, Georgia, with Bibles in their hand, and we're condemned. And he goes with an automatic weapon, and he's given offers of congressional internship. This is where America is tonight. It is startling, not surprising, but startling, and it brings a real threat to those white and black that want to stand up against systemic racism in this country.
And the thing I tell my students that, you know, the key to an internship is being a good person, a moral citizen. Apparently, you just have to go out and murder people who you disagree with. Ellie, part of this, and you've been tweeting about this sort of consistently, I sometimes feel like you were actually in the courtroom. Part of what the national story is from Kenosha is the degree of empathy that African Americans had for these victims. I think in contrast to how many white Americans are sometimes ambivalent or trying to explain what happened to George Floyd or what happened to Walter Scott. Why do you think that is? Why do you think this case, even though the victims were white, why do you think it resonates so much with African Americans and why so many people are so passionate and disturbed by this ruling?
That's a great question. And my answer is because black people don't care about race. They care about justice. We want justice to be done. This person came outside of his community, armed himself with a legal weapon, and shot 2 people in the street, people during a protest for police brutality. Yes, right. We care. It doesn't matter that the victims were white, not to black people. It doesn't matter that the victims were white. It matters that justice was not done. And that is something that honestly I do not understand why so many white people can't see that. It's like they're telling on themselves, right? It's the whole point here is that, and this is where, you know, I'm going to bring up, I think there's a theory about it that asks you to critically think about how systems work in this country, right? Like there is a pall of permissiveness towards white violence. And black people, regardless of the victim of any one instance of white violence, black people know that overall, white people armed with guns patrolling the streets, being allowed to shoot whoever they want to, doesn't work out so well for us, right? No. So there is a concern about justice. There's a concern about fairness. There is some self-preservation. There is that I know that doesn't work out for me very much. But it's also that we understand the system. And the last point I'll say is just that, you know, the people who kind of can't see that, who can't see the bigger picture, they're like people who are chewing on rosemary like a cow and like, man, this rosemary tastes bitter. And it's like, shut up, you uncouth idiot. It's supposed to go in the soup. There's a whole soup here. There's a whole soup of racism. And if you only pull out one bit or another bit, like you might miss the whole meal here. And black people care about the whole meal.
I like your chant of yes, we care, because that is a key part of this. As much as this is a black political cliche, I literally watched the ruling in the barbershop this afternoon. Not a person in the room was at all surprised. No one was surprised. In fact, everyone said, we're surprised that the judge didn't give him a gold star and a medal when he was done. Speaking of which, Paul, I want to go back to you. One of the most galling things about this entire experience, and there's not a person on this panel who didn't think that Rittenhouse was going to get off. But what did shock a lot of people is the behavior of just the judge. I want to play you a clip of just some of his greatest hits and get your thoughts on the other side as to what this does to our legal system when you see somebody behave like this in a trial that's so important.
The word victim is a loaded word.
I will tell you this. I'm going to think long and hard about live television of a trial again next time. I don't know. I've always been a firm believer in it because I think the people should be able to see what's going on. But when I see what's being done, it's really quite frightening.
I was astonished when you began your examination by commenting on the defendant's post-arrest silence. That's basic law. It's been basic law in this country for 40 years, 50 years. I have no idea why you would do something like that.
You know, Paul, I saw that. And I want to make this clear to anyone out there, you know, legal Twitter or legal commentary. There is not a prosecutor on the planet, okay? Johnny Cochran mixed with McCoy from Law and Order couldn't win a case when you have a judge behaving in this particular way. So, Paul, my question for you is, what does this do to people who are just observing this case? I mean, is this judge that common? And if he is that common, what hope is there for any future cases that have to do with Black Lives Matter, that have to do with criminal justice, if you've got guys like this planted throughout the country who are able to basically completely put their thumb on the scale of justice when it comes to a case?
Unfortunately, Jason, there are many judges in this country who tip the scales of justice in favor of the cause or side that they like. And when there's a verdict of not guilty, those concerns don't go away, but they're not resolved in any legal forum, because when a defendant is found not guilty, the verdict is final. The prosecution cannot appeal. I want to say, though, that the defense gets a lot of the credit or a lot of the blame. Mr. Rittenhouse had the best defense money can buy. His $2 million legal defense fund enabled his lawyers to use O.J. Simpson's jury consultant. And before the trial, they held 2 practice jury trials. That paid off well with Mr. Rittenhouse's well-rehearsed testimony when he took the stand. Most criminal defendants don't have those kinds of resources. Rittenhouse wouldn't either, but for people like Donald Trump and Matt Gaetz acting as cheerleaders for a man who gunned down 3 people.
Whenever we have a case like this, it has a larger sort of political resonance. I want to play Vice President Harris's comments after this. And Joy, I want your thoughts on the other side. What tone does she hit, and is it the right tone after this kind of ruling?
The verdict really speaks for itself. As many of you know, I've spent a majority of my career working to make the criminal justice system more equitable, and clearly there's a lot more work to do.
That left me a little cold. Joy, what was your thought when you heard that from the Vice President?
Right. I mean, I listen, she is a former prosecutor. And so, you know, as somebody who worked in the criminal justice system herself, she has a sort of foundational respect for the system. So, I wasn't expecting her to necessarily come out and emote about this case. Barack Obama didn't do it when he was president. Joe Biden isn't going to do it. But I think one thing that is important to remember, this is also a woman who, as a senator, tried to get an anti-lynching law enacted. And we have not been able to have an anti-lynching law enacted in this country, which has had more lynchings than I don't know of any other country that's done it the way we've done it here in this country. We can't get an anti-lynching law here because people don't want it. They don't want to legislate in that area. She tried to do things to push criminal justice reform, police reform. She was behind that. She and Cory Booker strongly supported it. That is dead. And I want to also remind you, we talked about this judge. He is elected. He is a politician. He is an elected official in the state of Wisconsin. He wasn't appointed there. So a lot of this has to do with the other piece that she is attempting to work on, which is the vote. Is can people get access to the means by which you could replace this man? And also, do you bother? He ran unopposed the last time that he was put in that office. And the last thing I'll say is that we need to really zoom out. We want Kamala Harris to be all things to all people, right? It's her, she has to represent everything Black. But she's not the only person responsible to do that. This system is not on her shoulders. She didn't create it. She's as much a victim of it and lives under it just like we do on this panel. It's not her job to fix it. This is a problem white America has to do, and they need to look inward and don't look for a Black lady to come zooming in and on her white horse to fix it and to fix your feelings about it. Because the problem is, there's an LA Times reporter that talked about the fact that all the far right groups from the Proud Boys on were just absolutely licking their chops today. They were acting like they won the Super Bowl, according to this Los Angeles Times reporter. Because what we need to worry about is that we have nothing in place legally. We have nothing in place culturally or socially to stop the next group of white nationalists, Proud Boys, MAGA people, whoever they want, to take from this verdict what they want and to use it as permission to attack Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter ain't just Black people, as we just saw. Mr. Huber and Mr. Rosenbaum are white. They're Jewish. They are also victims and easily made victims, because anyone who supports Black Lives Matter should be very afraid tonight.
She was only president for a couple hours today. We can't expect her to fix everything. Joy Reid, thank you so much for letting me sit in the seat tonight. Paul Butler, Elie Mystal, and Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you for joining us and starting off the show as well.